This is Jack's Nightmares broadcasting from a safe place. If you can hear me, you're one of the last. What you're about to hear is the story of a survivor, or at least someone who tried to be. Subscribe and comment if you're still out there. And now, let's begin. I remember the evening we realized everything had changed. It was as if the ground vanished beneath our feet, leaving us suspended in uncertainty. I worked in an office tower with tall glass windows that overlooked a busy city center. Cars, buses, and an endless crowd of people used to pass below my floor every single day. Then, a sudden outbreak swept through the streets, and those crowds vanished. For a while, the media tried to maintain control. News anchors claimed the situation was contained, that specialists were on the way, and that the public had nothing to worry about. But we all knew they were reaching for hollow reassurance. We saw the caution tape in the streets, the city vehicles that tried to redirect traffic away from entire neighborhoods. Then came the signs posted on every building entrance. Warnings about an infection that spread at an alarming pace. No more illusions could hide the truth. The city fell silent, and we discovered that we might be the only ones left in the skyscraper. I'm not entirely sure how many of us were still present by the time the doors were locked. What began as a staff of dozens had dwindled down to a handful. Some fled when the first signs of trouble appeared. Others stayed, hoping the office tower would be the safest place. We had working computers, a cafeteria with spare food, and phones that could reach the outside world. That was the plan, until everything began to fail. I woke up under my desk early that morning. My office floor was on the 23rd level, and I had pulled an all-nighter with two co-workers, Arya and Joseph. We slept in shifts, afraid that something might come knocking on the glass doors. Power was still flowing. Dull emergency lights in the corridors flickered sometimes, but at least they illuminated the halls. The environment felt muted, like stepping into a forgotten space where no one dared to speak above a whisper. We didn't hear from our families, though we tried every phone number we could remember. Cellular service lasted a while, then became unreliable. Once the tower's internet stopped working, panic set in. Arya paced near the window, eyes darting between the empty roads below and the rooftops across the horizon. Joseph tried to maintain composure, but I could sense he wanted answers. I think we all did. That first day, we formed a plan. Gather supplies from each floor and bring them to a central spot. The conference room on our level seemed like the best choice. It was large, had only one door, and contained a sturdy table that could be used as a barrier if needed. Our group took inventory of anything edible, any bottles of water, and any first aid kits left behind. This was a mundane process, yet the constant tension weighed on me. Every time we opened a door, the possibility of seeing something terrifying on the other side kept us on edge. We noticed that the entire building had become eerily silent. The usual hum of downtown traffic was replaced by an unsettling stillness. Even the flicker of fluorescent tubes in the hallway seemed amplified. At one point, Joseph whispered that we should head to the rooftop for a better view of the city, just to see what was happening. Arya and I agreed. Perhaps we'd see helicopter lights or rescue convoys. So we made our way to the stairwell. As soon as we opened the door to the stairwell, we found it deserted. Normally, there would be echoes of people moving between floors. Instead, the air felt heavy, as though we had stepped into a sealed box. We carefully ascended flight after flight until we reached the roof access. The metal door leading outside was locked from within with a large chain. A small, tinted window let us glimpse the open sky. We peered through it and noticed thick clouds rolling in, giving the city an even gloomier appearance. There were no signs of rescue above us, just emptiness. We returned to the conference room and planned out how to ration our resources. We discovered about 15 cans of soup, 2 jugs of water, and some leftover items from the office snack pantry. It wouldn't sustain us for long. Worst of all, the building's tap water had started coming out in an odd color. We decided to boil it whenever possible, but that required electricity, and we suspected the power grid might go out any moment. Despite the tension, I tried to keep my mind steady. I busied myself with tasks, counting supplies, testing laptops, to see if any connection was left. Arya wrote down everything we might need if we had to evacuate. Flashlights, duct tape, small toolkits, and a few office chairs we could repurpose as barricades. Joseph, meanwhile, investigated each floor. He reported that the lower levels seemed deserted except for a few offices that were locked. The only real worry came when Joseph mentioned a dark stain at the end of a hallway on the 19th floor. It looked like something had dragged itself across the carpet. We avoided describing it further, but the implications were enough to prompt us to consider barricading the stairwell at certain points. That idea became a cornerstone of our plan: limit access from floors below, secure the levels above, and remain as hidden as possible. At dusk, the city looked lifeless from our vantage point. Street lamps flickered, some never lit up, while others blinked in and out sporadically. Cars sat abandoned in the middle of roads. Occasionally, we thought we saw movement on the rooftops. Whether it was the wind or a lone survivor, we never found out that evening. Our small group decided to maintain watch shifts overnight. One person stayed awake for 3 hours, then woke the next person. We used the 23 RD floor lounge, which had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. From there, anyone on watch could see most of the neighboring buildings. We hoped that if rescue teams arrived, we would catch their signal lights. I took the first shift. Arya and Joseph tried to get some rest in the conference room, huddled under blankets taken from a supply closet. I sat in a swivel chair with a flashlight and a pair of binoculars, which I found in someone's desk drawer earlier that day. Through the glass, the street seemed more ominous than ever. Now that night had fallen, the occasional flicker of a damaged street lamp felt more unsettling than comforting. About halfway through my shift, I heard a faint thumping echo through the empty office. I stood up and shined my flashlight into the corridor. Nothing. The noise stopped. I waited, crouched behind a desk, listening for any clue. The faint hum of electricity from the emergency lights was the only persistent sound. Then, just as I was about to dismiss the noise, it returned. 2 dull thumps, as though someone tried to push open a heavy door. I crept toward the hallway, checking each corner. My grip tightened around the flashlight. The corridors were dim. At one point, I thought I saw a shape move past an open doorway, but it could have been a trick of the light. The next few minutes felt like an eternity, but eventually the noise faded into silence. I tiptoed back to my watch post and finished out my shift, glancing between the city lights and the hallway behind me. Nothing else disturbed me that night. When it was time to wake Arya for her turn, I spoke in hushed tones about the noises. She nodded, fully awake in an instant, looking more concerned than I expected. That expression left me uneasy. She whispered that we should be extra careful. With a determined look, she set up her own watch, propping her feet on the windowsill, shining the flashlight toward the hallway every few minutes. Morning light crept over the rooftops, bathing the office in a pale glow. It was almost comforting, reminding us that at least the sun still rose, unaffected by the chaos. Joseph reported hearing nothing on his shift. Arya said she caught the same echoing thumps once, but they vanished quickly. We all felt uneasy. Still, we proceeded with a plan: gather more supplies from the upper floors. Most were corporate offices, but we hoped to find a vending machine or leftover lunches. Our hopes fell flat. Floor 24 was nearly empty, just a few desks and a locked supply room with tinted glass windows. Joseph tried to peek inside, but saw only shelves stacked with binders and office supplies. Arya discovered something that made her uneasy: an abandoned radio set on a desk, still turned on, but producing only faint static. She turned the dial, pressing her ear close, then looked at us with a somber expression. There were no broadcasts, just quiet distortion. We took the radio back to our conference room, thinking it might be useful later. By midday, Our group decided to test the elevators. If they were working, we could descend to the parking garage to search for anything left in cars. The idea was both hopeful and dangerous. If the building's generators failed while we were inside the elevator, we'd be trapped. Yet we couldn't ignore the prospect of water or other resources. The elevator panels still had power, so we stepped inside. The ride down felt surreal, a gentle hum as the floor numbers ticked lower. We reached the parking level without incident. The basement was dark, lit only by emergency lanterns that flickered at odd intervals. The air felt stale, tinged with the scent of damp concrete. Rows of cars stood in neat lines, many covered in a thin layer of dust. We split up, quietly checking doors and trunks for supplies. I managed to find a few half-empty water bottles and a first aid kit. Arya discovered a backpack with spare clothes. Joseph stumbled across a locked sedan with something inside its front seat. He pressed his face to the window and froze. He beckoned me over without making a sound. I walked up slowly, shining my flashlight inside. There was a single bag on the front seat, ripped open. A smear of something stained the leather, trailing across the passenger side. We decided not to break the window. It was too risky to attract attention, and we weren't sure we wanted to discover more. While heading back to the elevator, Joseph drew our attention to a metal door in the corner of the parking lot. It led to a stairwell that rose to the street level. A few beams of light showed through a cracked panel near its top, revealing it was unlocked. We debated whether to check outside, but the presence of the unknown infection made us wary. We decided to seal that door with a heavy chain, just in case anything roamed near the basement. That chain became our thin line of defense against a world that felt more hostile by the minute. We returned to our floor, weighed down by the meager supplies we'd gathered. It was not nearly enough. Our focus shifted to rationing everything carefully. One can of soup split among the three of us was not exactly a feast, but we had no other choice. We tried to stay optimistic. The second night, we heard more unsettling sounds. At first it was light tapping on the other side of the office door. Then it escalated to heavier footsteps in the corridor. We doused our lights and pressed ourselves against a wall, listening intently. I sensed Joseph's anxiety as he gripped a piece of broken chair leg we'd fashioned into a makeshift defensive tool. Arya clutched the flashlight, her knuckles white. The tapping turned into scraping, like someone dragging an object across the floor. It faded away after several long moments. We didn't dare move or speak. Even the hum of the emergency lights couldn't mask the tension in that dark room. When we finally worked up the courage to peer into the hallway, we found it empty. No sign of who or what had made that sound. But something was off. The tall, potted plant that once stood near the elevators had toppled over, as if it had been kicked. Bits of soil trailed across the carpet toward a corner. That was enough to push us back into the safety of our makeshift barricade. We woke up to a low beep resonating from somewhere within the building. It sounded like an alarm or a backup generator warning. This repeated at irregular intervals, echoing from floor to floor. Whenever the beep stopped, a wave of silence followed, deeper than before. Arya decided to search for the source of that noise. She reasoned that if it was a generator alarm, we might be able to reset or preserve it. Joseph and I accompanied her, each of us holding flashlights. The hum of the building's emergency power had grown weaker, lights flickering more often. We traveled floor by floor, following the periodic beep. It led us to a locked maintenance room behind the elevator shafts on the 15th floor. The sign on the door warned of high voltage. Arya tried the handle. It was stuck. We tried to force it open with a crowbar we found in an old supply closet, but it barely budged. Eventually, Joseph gave it a well-placed shove, and it swung open. Inside, we found complicated panels, switches, and circuit breakers. An old generator in the corner made a rattling sound, flickering lights on its panel. One of them was blinking red. We quickly understood that the generator was nearly out of fuel. It was only a matter of time before the building lost its last vestiges of electricity. We had no spare fuel. Even if we did, None of us were sure we could operate that thing properly. Our only option was to turn off most floors from the breaker box, leaving only a few crucial circuits active. Perhaps that would buy us another day of emergency power. After much trial and error, we managed to shut down entire sections of the building. We hoped we wouldn't need to enter those dark corridors. Around midday, we returned to the conference room. Joseph started coughing, looking pale. He shrugged it off, claiming it was just nerves. Arya and I exchanged glances, concerned. We set aside a bit of extra water for him, though we had little left to spare. That afternoon, we heard distant shouts echoing from one of the lower floors. A voice calling for help, then abrupt silence. We debated whether to respond. Our instincts warred with our conscience. If there was another survivor, it felt wrong to ignore them, but the risk was impossible to ignore. Arya and I decided to investigate while Joseph stayed behind to rest. We descended the dark stairwell, flashlights illuminating only a few steps ahead at a time. The air felt stale, and each step caused our shoes to scuff against dust and debris. We passed the 20th floor, then the 19th, each door shut tight. Finally, on the 18th floor, we heard a faint sobbing sound. We pushed open the door, scanning the hallway. Papers were scattered across the floor, along with overturned chairs and desks. At the far end of the corridor, we spotted a figure slumped against a wall. We approached slowly, calling out softly. The figure was a colleague from accounting, a man named Reese, who had disappeared at the start of the crisis. He lifted his head, eyes wide with what seemed like relief. He rambled about the infection, about how people lost control. He said there was something, or someone, wandering the floors. He showed us a small cut on his arm, insisting he got it while trying to push through a broken door. His face was etched with worry. We helped him up and carefully guided him to the stairwell. The entire time, I felt as though something else was watching us. Every squeak of the floor made me jump. We arrived back at the conference room, where Joseph lay on one of the tables, clearly exhausted. Arya and I introduced Reese, though we weren't sure if we could fully trust his story. He seemed genuine, but in these circumstances, fear can twist truths. That night, the four of us tried to share the limited food, but it was hardly a meal. Reese told us more about his time on the lower floors. He claimed to have seen groups of people searching for supplies only to turn on each other. He mentioned seeing them in the shadows, ignoring pleas for help. It was difficult to imagine the folks from other departments acting like that. But desperation changes people. Joseph's cough worsened. We offered him whatever comfort we could, but we were rapidly running out of medicine. He insisted he would be fine, though his eyes darted around anxiously. A dreadful silence filled the corridors outside. Even the generator's beeping had stopped, leaving only the low hum of lights, which flickered more often now. Around midnight, Reese took first watch, while the rest of us tried to sleep. Not long after, I heard distant footsteps again. I opened my eyes to see Reese stepping into the hallway. He held a small flashlight, shining it around. I asked him what he was doing, and he whispered that he was going to check something he heard near the elevator bank. I didn't want him wandering alone, so I got up to follow. We turned the corner and found the corridor completely dark. My flashlight's beam cut through the blackness, revealing only office doors and desks. Then, from somewhere down the hall, came a faint scraping noise. Reese gestured for me to remain quiet. We moved closer, each step slower than the last. The hallway felt endless. Suddenly, a door creaked open on our left. My beam landed on it just in time to see it close again. Reese raised his hand for me to stop. We held our breath, listening. A soft rustling sound came from behind that door. Carefully, Reese reached out and tried the handle, but it was locked. We exchanged a worried glance, then tiptoed back to the conference room. Neither of us slept easily that night. At dawn, the lights flickered several times in rapid succession, and then blinked out. Darkness swallowed the corridor. A few seconds later, the dim emergency bulbs flickered back on, but weaker than before. It was a sign the generator was on its last legs. Without power, we'd have no way to keep the building lit, no means to boil water, and no sense of security. We needed a new plan, fast. Joseph was in bad shape. Arya checked his temperature with the first aid kit thermometer, and the reading was concerning. Reese hovered near the door, looking lost. I suspected we had entered the final stretch of our time in this building. Water was running low, food nearly gone, and now our source of power was failing. We gathered around the conference table to discuss next steps. Reese suggested trying to reach the rooftop again, maybe to signal someone using a mirror or a flare. Arya argued that we should head to the parking garage and try to exit through the chain-locked door to the street. Joseph wanted to wait it out just a bit longer, possibly out of fear that he wouldn't survive a journey outside. It was a tense conversation. None of us knew what was best. Ultimately, we agreed that we'd pack our bags with what supplies remained and attempt to head to the rooftop once more. We reasoned that if the streets were truly overrun, the rooftop might be our only place to draw rescue, if there was any rescue at all. We spent the morning barricading the stairwell doors behind us as we made our way up. Reese carried Joseph's backpack so that Joseph could hold on to the railing. Arya clutched a flashlight in one hand and a small folding chair leg in the other. I led the way, scanning each landing with a cautious beam of light. We reached the 25th floor, just below the roof access. That level had once been home to executive offices. The glass walls and plush carpets felt out of place in our current predicament. Though we had passed this level before, something felt different now. An office door stood open, revealing a boardroom with scattered documents. A flicker of movement drew our eyes inside. Cautiously, I stepped in, calling out a greeting. No response. My flashlight scanned the long table, the chairs, the large windows that overlooked the city. Then I heard a shuffle near the corner of the room. A silhouette slipped out of view. I felt my pulse jolt as I tried to keep my composure. The figure might be frightened, or worse. Arya joined me, shining her light in the same direction. We crept toward the corner and discovered a stack of broken chairs. Behind them, hunched low, was a person. Their clothes were disheveled, and their eyes had a distant look. We asked if they were okay, but they only groaned softly, rocking back and forth. Reese approached from behind, urging caution. Joseph stayed by the doorway, leaning against the frame. I tried again to speak to the individual, but they recoiled, trembling. Their arms had several bandages, and their breathing was shallow. Arya knelt down to offer help, but the person scrambled to the opposite corner, letting out a muffled whimper. It became clear they were not in a stable state of mind. We left a half-full water bottle on the floor and backed away. There wasn't much else we could do. The last thing we wanted was to agitate them further. We told them we were heading to the roof, just in case they found the will to follow. Then, with heavy hearts, we returned to the stairwell and continued upward. We arrived at the final landing. The chain we had previously seen was still on the door, but someone had partially undone it, leaving the padlock hanging loose. A strong draft pushed against the door, making it shake in its frame. I reached for the chain, my hand tense. If the rooftop was compromised, we might find ourselves in a vulnerable position. Reese helped me pry the chain free. Arya readied her makeshift club. Joseph stood behind us, trying to steady his breathing. The moment we swung the door open, a gust of wind rushed in. The rooftop stretched out before us, empty except for a few air conditioning units and a metal railing along the edge. Grey clouds loomed above, promising rain. From this vantage point, we saw much of the city, and it was not encouraging. Smoke rose from several blocks. Empty streets crisscrossed the urban landscape. Occasionally we spotted figures moving in the distance, but we couldn't tell if they were simply people like us or something else. The air felt thick with a sense of isolation. Arya rummaged through her bag and pulled out a compact mirror. She tried reflecting sunlight toward the horizon, hoping it might catch someone's attention. Joseph leaned against a vent, eyes half closed. Reese stood near the railing, scanning the skyline. Minutes dragged on, turning into an hour. Our attempts at signaling felt futile. No one responded. The wind picked up, bringing a slight drizzle. Rain spotted the rooftop, turning the concrete slick. Joseph shivered, and I realized we couldn't stay up here indefinitely. We were exposed to the elements, and Joseph's condition was worsening. We huddled near the rooftop entrance, deciding our next move. Reese argued we should descend and try the parking garage door again. Arya hesitated, recalling the deserted streets we saw. Joseph was in no shape for a long trek, but staying put meant slow deprivation. I glanced between them, torn by conflicting fears. Survival in a world that had seemingly collapsed was a gamble at best. Finally, we agreed to at least check the door to the outside from the lobby. The chain in the parking garage might still hold, but the main lobby entrances could have changed since we last checked. If it was safer to exit that way, we'd gather the courage to face whatever lay beyond. Before we left, we assembled a small pile of items on the rooftop, an improvised signal station. We laid out reflective surfaces, an old office jacket shaped into a flag, and placed it where it could catch the wind. If by some miracle rescuers arrived, they might notice the unusual display. Then we started our descent. Each step down felt like stepping deeper into a place we no longer recognized. Reese held Joseph steady, and Arya brought up the rear, flashlight beam quivering against the walls. I led the way, scanning each stairwell door for movement. The building groaned around us as if it, too, was weary of the long vigil. We reached the lobby level, flashlights dancing over the polished floors that once bustled with employees. Rows of chairs stood in neat lines, a reminder of a more orderly time. Sunlight streamed through the glass entrance, illuminating dust particles in the air. At first glance, the lobby appeared empty, but then a figure stepped out from behind the reception desk. It was a person draped in a coat that had definitely seen better days. They turned to face us, eyes wide, and raised a hand, perhaps in greeting. Arya froze, and Reese tightened his grip on Joseph's arm. I took a cautious step forward, speaking in a calm voice. The figure responded with quiet words that we could barely hear. They seemed fearful, perhaps as uncertain of us as we were of them. We moved slowly, showing we had no ill intentions. The person stepped aside, revealing a large sliding door behind them. It was jammed, half open, with shards of broken glass on the floor. Beyond it was the street. Outside light cast everything in sharp contrast. The figure tried to convey something about the outside, but they were so agitated that their words tumbled together. We gleaned that there might be hostile individuals out there, or possibly groups that refused to share resources. It was a risk we had to weigh carefully. Still, we were running out of time. Joseph could barely stand, and the building was losing power. We had to make a decision: stay in the building or step into the unknown. The four of us huddled near the main entrance, while the stranger lingered by the desk, eyeing us warily. The street beyond looked deceptively calm. Few vehicles, a few flickering street lamps, and tall buildings with shattered windows. No immediate sign of any infected or malicious groups, but we understood that didn't guarantee safety. Reese and Arya wanted to try the parking garage exit since we had a vehicle or two that might still work if we were lucky. That would mean trekking down more flights of stairs, unlocking the chain door, and then hoping one of the cars had enough fuel. Joseph, now too weak to walk far, sat on a lobby chair, resting. I contemplated whether it might be easier to slip out through the main doors on foot, searching for a safer place nearby. Perhaps a grocery store or a medical center, if any remained functional. Our scattered rumors and sightings suggested that might be an enormous gamble. We took a moment to check Joseph's condition again. His breath came in labored gasps, and the water bottle in our pack was nearly empty. We realized that no matter what path we chose, it had to be done soon. We decided to attempt the main exit, stepping into the city itself. If the situation turned too dangerous, we could retreat back into the building, though none of us felt very confident about that plan. Reese helped Joseph to his feet and Arya held open the jammed sliding door so we could squeeze through the gap. I led, flashlight in one hand, scanning the street. The city greeted us with an eerie hush. Our footsteps on the pavement echoed between tall buildings. Deserted cars lined the road, some with doors ajar, others with shattered windows. We moved cautiously, staying close together. The air felt thicker outside, carrying faint smells of dust and smoke. We navigated around the corner, searching for any sign of people or a safe place to rest. Broken streetlights dangled overhead. Occasional gusts of wind made old flyers rustle along the sidewalks. Distant shapes moved at intersections, but we couldn't tell if they were friend or foe. At one point, we ducked behind an abandoned bus when we heard voices, only to realize they were echoing from a nearby alley. We stayed hidden until the sound faded, then moved on. As we ventured farther from the office tower, I paused to look back. The sleek glass exterior, once a symbol of daily routines and professional lives, now looked as lifeless as everything else around us. Part of me longed to return to the relative familiarity of those corridors and conference rooms, no matter how bleak they had become. Yet we all recognized that we had to keep moving forward. We rounded another corner and found a small courtyard with benches and a water fountain that no longer functioned. There, in that silent, open space, we paused to catch our breath. Joseph sank onto a bench, resting his head against the concrete wall. Arya and Rhys stood watch on either side, scanning for threats. I crouched beside Joseph, offering the last drops of water we had. He gave a weak nod, trying to show gratitude. The day was quickly slipping away, and we still had no clear destination. From my vantage point, the skyscraper we had called home for 4 days stretched into the grey sky. Its windows glimmered in the fading afternoon light. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else remained inside, if the hush we had experienced was simply the building's final state, or if new survivors would eventually stumble upon our makeshift signals. In the end, our story in that tower might have been just one of many playing out across the city. But for us, those 4 days of silence changed everything. The swirl of fear, uncertainty, and desperate hope left a mark on each of us. Stepping into the open felt both liberating and paralyzing. We continued onward, guided by an unspoken resolve. Even in the silence, we carried each other's trust. Though we couldn't be sure what awaited us, we knew turning back wasn't an option anymore. Each new street corner, each hushed alley, each abandoned building was a new riddle to solve, a new risk to take. In this transformed city, quiet moments can be as unnerving as any threat. A whisper of wind can stir images of unseen watchers behind dark windows. Every echo of a distant sound sets nerves on edge, sending the mind into a spiral of what-ifs. Yet it was those quiet stretches that taught me how precious every step forward can be. I remember the view from the tower's rooftop, the sense of finality as we stared out over an empty skyline. That was the moment I realized silence doesn't always mean peace. It can mean everything else has crumbled, leaving behind an echo of all that once was. Our small group vanished into the deserted streets, leaving that tower behind. Its corridors full of memories and the lingering presence of those who never left. In that building's stillness, one could hear the faint hum of overhead lights, the drip of a leaky faucet, and perhaps a door creaking somewhere on a locked floor. Maybe it's the wind, or maybe something else. All I know is that in a place devoid of human presence, even the smallest sounds can become a chorus of unease. We never learned the full story of the infection. We never discovered whether a rescue team arrived on the rooftop after we left, or if the building simply went dark, one flickering light at a time. Perhaps it stands now as a quiet monument to the fragility of normal life. That was our reality for 4 days. 4 days of an unearthly hush that seemed to stretch on forever. 4 days that ended with us stepping into the unknown, guided by little more than hope and a handful of battered supplies. Even now, as I recount these memories, I can almost hear the distant beeping of the generator, the thump of unseen footsteps in vacant corridors, and the hush that followed once the power went out. Those echoes remain with me, a reminder of what happens when the familiar world goes silent. And though I don't know what fate lies ahead for our group, I carry the weight of that silence wherever I go. After all, in a city once brimming with activity, the sudden absence of everyday noise is sometimes the most unsettling sound of all. That's all for now. But don't mistake the end of the story for the end of the nightmare. If you're still listening, like, comment and subscribe. Keep the signal alive. And remember, in a world like this, the real horror begins when the voices go silent.